Good evening. I call to order the Wednesday, 16 January 2019 meeting of the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee. This evening, we will address the committee's review and discussion of governance relating to the potential town acquisition and ownership of the water system. Committee member Josh Krumholtz will lead that discussion, and after Josh has completed his presentation, I will first ask committee members if they have questions or comments, and then I will open the floor to the public. Josh, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that not too much reverberation? Okay, so I think, John, I want to take it at kind of two stages to repeat our phrase of showstopper. I'm going to look at it, I'm going to talk about it first from a showstopper perspective, and then talk about it a little more granularly in terms of what kind of governance options we've looked at and may want to consider if the decision is made to go forward with acquisition. So just as a reminder, as we all know, we're looking at service area A, which is about 13,000 connections, about 8,200 in Hingham, 4,600 in Hull, and about 335 in Cohasset. In terms of what was done in terms of looking at governance issues, we, and the we is not necessarily just members of this committee, like Charlie Cristello has volunteered and helped. Some of you may remember Charlie was town administrator for many years. Members of Board of Selectmen have played a role. We've all spoken with various people over time. We've talked to a number of towns, both towns that provide water just for themselves and also towns that provide water for themselves and neighboring towns. We've looked at some of the legal requirements. We've talked with legal counsel. We've met with Cohasset and Hull representatives, spoken with Mass DEP, and looked at various state statistics. I'm sure other things were done as well, but that's kind of generally the kind of research that we got involved with. So when we're looking at whether there's a showstopper in doing this, whether this is just a really bad idea or we're kind of out on a limb to even be considering it, the thing we most looked at was what other towns were doing. The logic being, if towns are not doing this, if they don't own their own water system, then, well, should we be the exception? I mean, maybe the answer is still yes when you look at the light plant and that success, but, you know, it makes a less compelling case. And conversely, if a lot of towns are doing this and doing this relatively simply, that would be an indicator to us that, you know, we're certainly capable of doing this from a governance perspective, particularly in light of what I think is a very strong town governance in and of itself. It's run really well, both in terms of employees and in terms of volunteers. So the information, and a lot of this has been talked about already, but the information that we got in terms of other town activities with regard to water systems was, to me, startling. You know, there's about 350 towns. Let's exclude the 60 that are MWRA. I mean, you can make an analogy, but I don't think we need to. The vast majority of towns control their own water systems. Not only that, well, and I'll get to this a little more, but a lot of them also either receive, the water system is controlled by that town or by a neighboring town. We looked specifically at our cohort. So we are, what do we say, 13,000 connections. When you look at it in terms of data, we're considered a mid-size system. Mid-size being defined as between 10 and 25,000. There are 41 towns in Massachusetts that fall into that category. 40 of them are public water. We are the outlier. When I say we're the outlier, we are the outlier. We're the only town that is not being served by a public system. So when we look at that from a showstopper perspective, it seems reasonably compelling that Hingham has the ability to at least do what other towns are doing, at least as well as those other towns are doing them. Another question, which I just started to allude to, which came up yesterday and has come up a lot, is, well, okay, but service area A is not just Hingham. It is a significant Hull piece and a much smaller Cohasset piece. Does that create insurmountable barriers? In a little bit, I'll talk about some of the detail on that and what can and should or needs to be done with regard to that kind of intramunicipal scenario. But the bottom line from a showstopper perspective was, again, that this is a very common thing. You know, we talked to a couple towns directly where they control water for themselves and for neighboring towns, and they expressed no problems, no issues. But even more fundamentally, the vast majority, well, the majority, it may be the vast, but I don't want to say that because I'm not sure if that's 100% correct, but the majority, at least, of towns either supply water to another town or are supplied water from another town. So it's more common than not that you have this kind of scenario. I mean, I would be speculating as to why, but it's not hard to envision that, you know, water systems grew up around efficiencies that were not necessarily, you know, constrained by town political barriers, right? And that's just the way it has kind of evolved over time. So it's not the bottom line is it's not unusual. Indeed, it's very usual for a water system to cover more than one town without creating a barrier or a showstopper. So I think from a showstopper standpoint, we didn't see anything in the research that we did that would suggest that this is something that shouldn't be done, couldn't be done, is really problematic to do, or otherwise would suggest that it's just not something we should do. Okay. So getting into a little more of the specifics, we did spend some time kind of trying to understand how these water systems are governed in these other towns. You know, one of the things that we have talked about, we talked about it because it overlaps with financial issues, is we would certainly want to do it through an enterprise fund. We talked about this before, but for folks that were not part of that discussion, an enterprise fund allows you to capture in one place the revenue and expenses. So it becomes separate from the other town business, as it were. It's the enterprise would be self-funded through user and through ratepayers, and, you know, would operate in isolation. So I think that is generally accepted as the best way to do it, and certainly would be something that if we were to recommend a structure, we would, I think, certainly be recommending that. In terms of possible governance options, I've thought about it from a day one perspective, okay? And by that, I mean that the day 366 may be a different answer than day one. Like, if you've had a chance to live with something for a while, you may choose, based on that experience, to do some different thing. But we've been really, and I've been thinking about it from what is kind of the best way to do it if we want to go in the direction of acquisition from day one. I think, as we've talked about before, an important part of this would be to retain a management company. We've, of course, spent some time sending out requests and getting information on how much that would cost. And that's already been built into the financial model. But I'm probably stating the obvious. I think a lot of this, frankly, is stating the obvious. A management company, getting somebody who's experienced to come in and run it while we get our legs under us is the most obvious thing to do. There are, as we know, experienced management companies out there, starting right next door in Cohasset. There are a number that we can choose from and potentially bid against each other, making sure, of course, we get the high-quality people that we want to get. But I think that would be a pretty critical component of this. The next question is water commissioners. All of the towns have water commissioners that are responsible for the overall policy making, rate setting, overall responsibility. Now, when I say water commissioners, there may or may not be separate individuals that are water commissioners. For a lot of these towns, the water commissioners are the Board of Selectmen. For some towns, they have separate water commissioners. Some towns, those water commissioners are elected. Some towns, those water commissioners are appointed. These are all different options on the table. Some of that, frankly, I think is more political, perhaps, than, this committee needs to be. Kind of goes beyond our purview, because I think some of that gets into, I don't mean political in a pejorative sense, but just kind of those kinds of issues. I think, from a day one perspective, that it makes sense to have the selectmen be the water commissioners, because they have been so actively involved in this process that I think if you go through the process of creating separate water commissioners right off the bat, you're creating a whole nother layer that has to get educated and learn and won't hit the ground running as well as the Board of Selectmen. Now, there has been comments, which I think are valid comments, that, that's a fair amount of work that's overlaid on top of all their other responsibilities. And they may conclude, or townspeople may conclude, or, there may be discussion about taking that off their plate after a year and having separate water commissioners set up, and that's fine. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing you would be thinking about on a going forward basis. But, you definitely need water commissioners. These people, whoever it is, need to, there is an online course that they would take. That, I think it's through the DEP as opposed to I'm sure it's the DEP, that would get them credentialed to be able to do that kind of work, and that's something I think we would want to require that the selectmen or whoever else it is do that. But that's kind of that would be the top layer of governance. Then I think you'd be looking at another layer of governance that would be the water superintendent. That would be somebody, in the business, a fully licensed superintendent with all of the requisite experience. That would be a full-time employee of the town. That would, I think we would contemplate that person reporting to the town administrator. That person's job would be, interfacing with the management, being, in the first instance, helping set, the capital plan, helping set, proposed rates, having overall responsibility for making sure all aspects of the enterprise are running smoothly. And, if RFPs need to go out for, capital projects, that person would have the first line of responsibility, all running through town administrator and the water commissioners, whoever they end up being, as part of the process. That person presumably would need some administrative support, whether that is something that could be supplied by the present personnel in the town, or whether somebody would need to be hired part or full-time. I think in the financials you've already assumed that there would be some additional burden on the administrative side. In terms of, I'll get to kind of the rate paying and the capital improvements from a cost perspective in a minute, but in terms of capital improvements themselves, that would be a vendor-based approach as well. If we decide to go forward with acquisition. That could be the same as the management company. One can imagine that there would be some efficiencies in having that be the same company. One can imagine that you can get more aggressive bids if it's more work. But it also could be, separate entities if, the decision was made that either that management company was greater management, but not necessarily the capital piece, or, that maybe you could have more competition. I mean, I think all those things would be made kind of in real time by the superintendent with the oversight from town administrator and the water commissioners, such as they are. You would also need to establish rules and regulations. We already have a significant head start on that from the standpoint that we've already acquired rules and regulations from a number of towns. These would be the kinds of rules and regulations about when you can, water bans and fire hydrants and, all the details and niceties of execution of the plan. Those would all, I don't know whether that needs to be part of our bylaws or not. I mean, that would be up to town council as to whether that was something that would have to be like voted on at town meeting. But regardless, that would have to be established. And as I said, we wouldn't want to just adopt another town's wholesale without being thoughtful about it. But we have work product from some towns, and we can get it certainly from more towns, and use that as a very significant starting point for establishing those rules and regulations. So let's talk about rate setting. This, to me, is the most significant piece. I personally think the most positive piece of town ownership. So as people presumably know, right now, there's a process where Aquarian needs to go to the DPU and go through a rate setting process, which they do every 3 years or 5 years. We had some discussion about that. That is an expensive proposition, both from the standpoint that there's a lot of costs that Aquarian incurs that could potentially get charged back to, or used as part of the base to set the rates. It could be an expensive proposition from the town's perspective, both Hingham and Hull, to the extent that if they want to challenge anything, that costs money because professionals are involved. But more fundamentally, while it's a semi-private, semi-public, if not fully public process, it's really not a very accessible process. I know you have, John, have mired yourself in the process, but I have not. I have no desire to. I think it's not accessible to the public as a practical matter. The DPU, does play a role of balancing the interests of Aquarian and the interests of the town, and there is some value there. I think that's offset a little bit by the realization that 99% of the last request got approved, which doesn't sound like we were protected all that much. And it's not, I'm sure the DPU does fine with it, but the reality is that they don't actually have a lot of experience because there's no other scenario like ours. There are very few towns, period, that have private companies servicing them, so the rate cases are, and there's none in our cohort, right? I mean, there's none in our size. So it's not like they have this big body of knowledge that they're developing and applying, right? They're kind of doing it as it comes. But there is value there, and that value would go away. And we certainly should acknowledge that and consider that. But to me, the biggest benefit is that the process for setting rates would be very public and very local, and therefore much more accessible. What we would contemplate, what we've talked about, and I think would recommend if we decide to go forward, is the creation of a citizens advisory board, right? So we have the water commissioner, we have really the town administrator is a layer there, the water superintendent, and whoever that person needs to support them. And over here, you would have a citizen advisory board. That can be made up of whatever we choose to make it up with. I think what, we've thought about is 3 Hingham people, 1 Hull representative, 1 Cohasset representative. Excuse me. And that advisory board can play a lot of different roles, and I think limited only by our imagination, but I think the 2 kind of most fundamental roles would be to play a meaningful role with inputting on the rate-setting process, where, and where in the process they step in. There's value, I think, at different places. Maybe they're right there at the beginning, working with the superintendent. Maybe the superintendent does the first crack at it because it's so much work, and they, input there. Maybe they're doing it, interacting with the selectmen. I think there's any place in there where they could be involved kind of proactively in helping provide input. And the other role of that advisory committee could also be to deal in the first instance with complaints and problems from individual users and ratepayers. Independent of the rate setting, they can play a meaningful role of being an outlet for complaints and problems and make recommendations to either the superintendent or the commissioners with regard to those problems. But I think what would be contemplated for rate setting is this process where the superintendent, with the benefit of the advisory committee, sets proposed rates that go to the selectmen and go through the process through town meeting, right? So they're going to be part of the budget setting process. So it will be as transparent as any other budget that we have in town and have as much opportunity for public input as any other budget that we have in town. And the same would be so for capital outlay. Right, it would be part of the capital process. Again, I think you would have the superintendent set, like any department, would make recommendations on what the capital outlay should be, but that would then go through, selectmen advisory, town meeting, and be approved as part of the capital budget. I say that, of course, it's enterprise fund, so it's separate, but process-wise, it would all be part of the same process. And that to me, is probably the most meaningful difference from a governance standpoint, and I think one of the biggest benefits. So, one of the issues to think about is, maintaining water quality. We want to make sure that the town would be in a position to maintain the same water quality, and the reality is, the town, just like Aquarian, has to work with DEP and make sure that all the requirements have been met. The town would work with DEP upon acquisition to make sure all operational requirements are met. I mean, they're going to have to do all those same things that Aquarian does, and they're going to have to, meet state standards. So it's not like the town would be suddenly thrust out there without knowing what standards are, without knowing what they have to do to keep the quality proper, at acceptable levels. That would all be done in conjunction with DEP, as it's done with Aquarian now. Long-term Cohasset and Hull, or short-term Cohasset and Hull. Based on what we've looked at, there is actually nothing that needs to be done of any formal nature with Hull and Cohasset. Basically, the town steps in the shoes of Aquarian. It becomes the owner, and it operates as Aquarian does in all material respects, and it becomes the provider for service area A, and there's a certain seamlessness to that. If you're in the system, you're in the system. Everybody gets treated the same in the system. There was a question yesterday, I think, that came up, and I reached out and had some discussions myself about this question of treating Hull and Cohasset somehow differently than Hingham. And I've been assured that it's very much the intention that Hull and Cohasset, aside from what the law requires, which I think the law requires that they be treated the same, that it's very much the intention to treat them all the same. A user is a user is a user, and everybody's going to be treated as a user. I think what the town likely would do were to go forward would be to basically just send out letters to Hull and Cohasset saying, kind of raising our hand saying, here we are. We intend to go on as business as usual. Obviously, just as Aquarian needs to work with Hull, Hingham would need to work with Hull. If a road needs to be dug up to get to a pipe, you got to work with the town to have the road dug up to get to the pipe. You know, there are levels of cooperation that need to happen, and that will happen just, no reason to believe it wouldn't happen just as easily with the town of Hingham as the owner as it would with Aquarian. I mean, over time down the road, I think anything is potentially open for discussion. I mean, that's not for us to recommend today, but I mean, there may be scenarios where Hull decides and Hingham agrees that, you know, Hull wants to buy and own its portion of the system. And that, you know, there's no reason that can't necessarily be on the table for discussion. I don't think we're in a position to recommend or not recommend something like that. Nobody may want that, or everybody may want that. But as of day one, you know, other than the fact that I think Hull and Cohasset residents, like Hingham residents, would benefit from the greater transparency in the rate-setting process, and then whatever financial benefits would inure equally to everybody. It's, you know, day one is the same as the previous day in terms of the interaction between them. So I would say, I guess my high-level observations, John, is, you know, when you look at the fact that we are virtually a singular outlier, that creates, to me, a certain presumption from a governance standpoint that not only is it doable, but there's a lot of reasons to do it. I mean, just, you know, that fact alone. I think the higher level of transparency, participation, accountability for things being done at the local level with people that voted in and out of office, I think is a significant positive. You know, I think the fact that you would have, you know, one set of masters, which is the ratepayers, you know, and I mean this is no disrespect to Aquarian, but they have shareholders that they have to be accountable to. They, you know, they have profit margins that they have to be accountable to, and they absolutely do. There's no judgment in that. They won't have a company if they don't do that. But that would not be, you know, part of the regime on this governance structure. This governance structure, it would be, you know, setting rates to cover expenses and making sure that we have a good system that continues to serve the users. And I would just say that I think, I know controlling the system is not controlling the water, I understand that, but water is a scarcer and scarcer resource, and controlling the system does give you a little more control over the water. And I think there is a significant benefit, aside from everything else, to just be the masters of our own water system and have that in our control and know that it stays in our control. So that's my presentation.
Wow. That's a lot of information in a remarkably short period of time. Thank you, Josh. Let me ask the committee first if it has some questions. Joe, why don't I?
John, you're right. That is a lot of information.
Say it all again?
No, that's fine. You raised obviously the issue of you know, other municipalities, the vast majority of the municipalities in the Commonwealth controlling their own systems, and you sort of held that out at the beginning as well. You know, if that's the case, then we can think of that as good evidence that there is no showstopper. Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that that's a good point. I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the fact that the other municipalities run their water system sort of runs through all of the other elements of your presentation as well. So the other municipalities who run their own water systems are subject to the DEP regulations on water quality, and they're able to comply with those. And in particular, I was struck by your comments about the multi-town systems. And is it the case that in multi-town systems that are municipally owned, that the residents from different towns who are within that system are treated the same in terms of the of the rates and the service that's provided to them?
I think legally they're required to. So, I mean, I don't think there's a lot of discretion in that, but yes, that's generally my understanding. And I should say that, when we talked to, not many towns, but when we did talk to a town about being intermunicipal, they just kind of looked at you like, yeah, and, right? I mean, it was not like, when I think it was Karen called up, I forget who she called up, but she talked with somebody on the state level about, how common is this? Mm-hmm. And they just kind of laughed at her and said, it's, it's all the time. Okay.
Yeah.
You talked about the difference between the DPU hearing process and the governance structure enabling a more transparent process. Can you describe a little bit what your perception is or what the research was relative to the DPU hearing process?
Well, I would actually turn to you. You're much deeper on the DPU hearing process. Well, so if that was the segue, why don't you explain?
Okay, so good question. Now, let me try to answer that. I think having, as Josh said, I don't know if I've been admired in it, but I certainly more familiar than I was 6.5 years ago. Ratepayers, all of us have the ability to write a letter to the DPU. When Aquarian files a petition with the DPU for a rate case, there are hearings. I think a question that I've had for at least the last rate case, 1790, since April 2017, is why Hingham hasn't had a hearing in Hingham as opposed to in Hull, since, as Josh said, we're about 8196 versus 4638 in terms of clients, but there are some public hearings. And then there is a rate hearing in Boston where folks can attend, but I don't know that they're able to actually speak. I think it's there basically to listen. And when I contrast that with what you've described, based on the research that you and others have done, I come away and you get much more of a feeling that voices can be heard and issues addressed much more expeditiously in this vehicle than in the DPU hearing process, where after the rate hearing occurs, basically the DPU, as was the case with this rate case, I think hearings for the amended rate case stopped in June of 2018, and the final order was not issued until October 31 for a November 1 effective date. And at that point, the DPU is kind of off the air. You don't know what's happening. No one, and as Ed Siegfried described last night, even with the initial October 31 order, the actual starting revenue number for service area A changed multiple times based on the successive revised compliance filings, which, as some may recall, was the first question that Barry Dunn, the expert firm that presented last Thursday, was asked. What was the starting revenue for service area A? So I guess my reaction, based on what I've seen at some remove, just, what are the numbers that are issuing forth from the rate case, is that it would be a lot more direct and a lot more transparent in terms of the process and the voice that folks would have, ratepayers would have, through the structure that you've presented. I guess the other aspect of that is rate case expense, and you alluded to that. I believe the latest compliance filing from Aquarian indicated that their rate case expense for 1790 was somewhat over $571,000, which Aquarian proposed to the DPU, and the DPU approved, would be amortized over 5 years, so that each year, roughly $94,000 will be added to what ratepayers will pay in order to pay for Aquarion's rate case filing expenses. Where the towns, Hingham and Hull, and in this case definitely was both towns, petitioned to be interveners on behalf of the towns, those are expenses, and I don't know what the exact expense was for 1790, but I have heard that typically it's somewhere in the $75,000 range, and that expense is a taxpayer expense that is split between the two towns. So when you add the ratepayer expense, $571,000 for 1790, that's the rate case, or docket number, I'm sorry, to the town expense, you're north of $650,000. I mean, you've got a fair amount of money that would not be expended in the process that you've described. I think that's a plus. A question that I had, I know when Selectman Johnson presented back in, I guess, early September, she presented a structure where the water superintendent would manage both the operations and maintenance vendor, as well as contract separately with the vendors that did capital improvement. And I'm wondering if in the researches that you all did, if in fact, you indicated that the O&M vendor might be the capital improvement vendor. I'm wondering, did you see or do you recollect any municipalities that might have had separate capital improvement vendors that were reporting through the O&M vendor? In other words, were contracted by the O&M vendor, which the reason I'm asking the question is because I think that would alleviate some potential jockeying between the O&M vendor and the capital improvement vendors about repairs, and it would certainly, to my view, reduce the workload of the water superintendent. I'm just wondering if you saw that structure.
We didn't get that granular, so
Okay.
I didn't see it or not see it. We didn't really specifically ask or look for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in my thinking about governance, and I have not done the research that you all did, I think if I were to opt for a structure for day one now, I'd opt for the structure where the O&M vendor was responsible for contracting with and managing capital improvement, just because I think it puts less of a burden on the water superintendent. And then, as you said, once you get feet under you, you can kind of change it as makes sense.
Yeah, and that, I think that starts getting to what the RFP looks like.
Exactly.
And how many different options you want to give the potential bidders on the RFP.
Exactly.
And see which kind of shakes out as the most efficient
Right.
and effective.
Yep. That's everything that I've got. Bob?
I do agree with the superintendent and the O&M people also being our capital, planning group. They would have not only access to all the company records, and they would become familiar with the system, and, through the superintendent, we'd have a part-time planner, possibly, to help intervene between the contractor and the town, just to make sure that we have all our checks and balances when we go to do our capital plan, that, we have prepared the documentation and the planning and, do the public bidding, and that should be done by either the engineer or a professional group, and they will also solicit the bids and open the bids and plan, organize, and control all the capital. Okay, and I think that's the most efficient way to do it. And that takes a pretty good load off the superintendent, who's going to have more than enough to do. I won't get into the duties and stuff like that right now, but it's a big job. It requires a lot. It requires a lot. It requires a lot of time, and it definitely requires a great deal of sitting down and thinking about everything you do. It's very important And from my perspective, I think that's a good way to go about it, John. I really do. Rules and regulations, the superintendent and the O&M company and the capital engineer group, they can sit down and they can put together, okay, a set of regulations. We have it in the SOAR Commission. It's a book of, it covers just about everything. You know, how you're going to operate and how you're going to treat the customers and rates and so forth and so on. And that's a living document that could be changed as you go along. You know, there are always new regulations and things that you have to implant into your program. So I think that's the way to go. And ultimately, when we get it all together, then you have to just present it to the town, at town meeting, or to the selectmen to go before the advisory, and I think that's the way to do it. I think it's efficient, and I think it provides all the necessary interaction between all the groups to plan, organize, and control, okay? And you have to do it the year before, because, you know, there's paving programs that you're going to have to be looking at, so there will be some work in that calendar year before you're going to work in that other capital, like you might have to replace water services or hydrants, or, you know, there's other work that might have to be done prior to that. So could be done during it, but generally speaking, sometimes you can go out, have an old one and get it out of there and replace it. That's a capital, you know.
We can talk more about that next Wednesday,
Okay.
right?
All right.
Well, actually, Bob raised something that I think is another plus for governance, for the town governance, excuse me, which is it becomes much easier to work with other aspects of the town, right? You can in practice be working with the road work to, you know, make sure that you're being as efficient as possible in terms of opening up roads, and if you have to open up a road for a different reason, maybe that you take the time to put new pipes in there, right? You know, I think there's been an instance in the past where the town's reached out to Aquarian to work with, you know, the Conservation Commission on property next to a watershed, and Aquarian didn't want to have anything to do with it, which is fine, that's their prerogative. But from a town standpoint, you know, if there are, you know, conservation issues that might impact the watershed, and we can be working together more coherently in that way on those issues as well, just as two examples.
And I guess my understanding is that similar to what Hingham implemented around 2011, I think, with its road building program, I guess Hull has just recently approved a similar program, so that would really accentuate the value of closer coordination. Any other questions from committee? Okay. Open it up to the floor for questions from the public, as is the practice. If you please raise your hand if you have a question and remark. When I recognize you, please step forward to the microphone, state your name and address, and address your question to me, and I will determine who can best provide an answer. So, ma'am.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Is it Krenholz? Thank you for your extensive presentation. My name is Polly Rowe. As I said last night, longtime former Hingham resident. I reside in Hull, 9 Rockview Road. I would like to please state my statements, comments, and some questions that fall into 4 different categories first, and then take my answers from you afterwards. The first category, from the first time that I heard that the Hingham selectmen are also going to serve as water commissioners, it's just my gut reaction. I immediately thought, isn't that a direct conflict of interest? Wouldn't it be much better to have one totally separate and not at all involved with the other? The other thing that came to mind when you mentioned other communities such as Cohasset, and last night a number of people talked about Situate and the disastrous, not only water quality problems that they've had, but just rates jumping up exorbitantly without the public really being aware of it and having input, and there's no control over that. And I'm also thinking of longtime friends that I've had in Cohasset, and somewhere in the recesses of my memory, I remember hearing in the past, I don't know if it's past 5 years or not, but Cohasset was having some very serious problems. I don't know if it was water quality, but it was definitely with the people that were running the system. I don't know if they got fired and rehired or whatever, but they were having some very serious problems. And we certainly don't want to be going through that. As Hingham is, so we say, finding their way in this new territory. That's one area. The second area is regarding what was brought up last night about MRAMs, and this goes to governance. Recently, we're in January 2019. Already, Hull has had 3 water main breaks within the past few weeks. MRAM is a state-approved plan to accelerate main replacement. The state-approved MRAM plan, along with DPU's oversight and regulatory protections that ensure equitable investment in infrastructure, will completely disappear under the town of Hingham's ownership. That's of great concern to me, to me and others. The third area is, last night, I heard one of you gentlemen say that the Hingham selectmen would charge Hull residents the same rates as Hingham residents. But Hull residents are paying more than 1/3. We're 36% of the total ratepayers, so we're going to be paying more than 1/3 of the total debt for Hingham to have exclusive ownership of this water system, but we don't have a voice to speak of, nor any ownership in your future water system. That does not seem fair nor equitable to Hull ratepayers. I would like to know how you feel about charging Hull residents the same water rates, but charging Hingham residents a surcharge to pay off its own debt, whether it's the acquisition and the legal fees that were incurred in going to court for the past 6 or 7 years. And last but not least, regarding the, whether you call it intermunicipal agreement or the memorandum of understanding, I would like to know if the town of Hingham has a framework in place currently regarding this memorandum of understanding between Hingham, Hull, and North Cohasset. Has there been, or is there currently underway, any discussion on this MOU? Secondly, when does the town of Hingham or this committee plan to devise and execute the MOU? Is it before or after April's town meeting? And when do you plan to make public the terms and conditions of the MOU and seek community input? And I ask you these questions, particularly as a Hull resident. I always think like a homeowner. I am a homeowner. I want to know the terms and conditions of the sale of a big ticket sale item that I'm going to be paying my money into, not at the last minute before I sign on the dotted line, but well in advance. So thank you for hearing me, and thank you for please addressing these questions.
Thank you.
I'm going to take them.
Go for it.
All right, so the first thing, and maybe I need to ask you a question. First thing you said was you feared a conflict of interest between the Board of Selectmen if they acted as commissioners, but I'm having trouble picturing what that conflict of interest would be. You know, they would be acting in the best interests of the ratepayers. I don't know if you have something in mind. I'm not picturing a conflict.
I'll give as an example my own personal experience. When we have come before the Hingham Board of Selectmen, anybody, getting what I would call equal professional, totally transparent treatment on questions we may have has been, how do I politely say, non-existent. So it's very hard to not feel, perception is reality, to not feel that somehow we're being discounted So
I'm sorry, but by the "we," do you mean Hull residents? Is that the "we"?
Yes.
I see.
Yes, and speak for Hull residents. So it's, I know from following our own Board of Selectmen's meetings, they have more than enough to do to, with their own, full-time jobs, personal lives, and doing the homework involved in being a selectman and the issues, and that includes listening to and hearing the public and their concerns, and they're various. There may be conflicting, opinions on that. That position, to me, would seem to be, needs to be totally separate from the people who are educated, experienced, informed on being the water commissioners. To me, it's a perception that, one could influence the other, and they should.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure that I can comment on your perception of the quality of the work that the selectmen do. I personally think very highly of the quality of the work that they do and their transparency. But that, to me, that's kind of a separate issue. In terms of the workload, yeah, I think there is some, they may decide that they don't want to take this on from the outset, and they want to set up commissioners because they don't feel that they have the bandwidth to do that. I think, that they need to be a really meaningful part of that process. I was recommending that that they be the commissioners at least for the first year, because they have all this knowledge that exists that will, I think, make the transition smoother and occur more quickly in that first year. And, that first year will then tell them whether the task is too big to go on after that or not. But I don't think I think that's all a matter of judgment, and it can go, in different directions. In terms of problems in Situate and perhaps in Cohasset, I mean, obviously, if you have enough towns, something is going to happen somewhere along the line. We can't, I think, make a decision based on the fact that a town has had an issue. I think we need to be careful that we are being really thoughtful about putting the professionals in place to make sure it's done right and working with DEP to make sure it's done right. But I also have no reason to believe that this town is not capable of doing that. I mean, if we have the light plant, if we want to look at example, I mean, the light plant, I think, most, if not all, people in the town of Hingham would say that's a godsend for the town and is run extremely well. And when everybody else's power goes out around the Commonwealth, we're sitting there with our lights on. So, I mean, there's precedent to show that we know how to do things like this. Hang on. Let me go. Well, have a seat, if you could. Let me go through your points. So I hear what you're saying, and I guess there's always some risk associated with any major decision, but I think there's the vast majority of the towns over the years have had no issues whatsoever. And looking at an isolated situation where a problem arises and then gets solved, I don't think kind of changes that fundamental observation. The MRAM plan, I'm not totally sure where you were coming from. I mean, we have, I think the plan, and this would be more engineering, but I think the plan is to start from the plan that Aquarian has created, spend that first year and looking at things and updating as necessary and making adjustments as necessary. But frankly, one of the motivations, I think, that started this whole process was a feeling that capital was not getting the proper attention from Aquarian a number of years ago. Now, I think they've done better. Query whether they've done better because there's been a lot more pressure put on them through this process in the last number of years. I mean, we saw them suddenly be able to refinance debt when they could have refinanced that many years earlier, which happened to come when we started to put pressure on them. I don't think Aquarian is like this be-all and end-all in terms of making sure capital improvements are being done properly and efficiently and as much as they should be. Having said that, they're obviously experienced and know what they're doing, but I have no reason to believe we're not capable of hiring the right people to make sure that's done well, both in terms of the correct superintendent and in terms of the right vendors doing that work. That's just things that will have to play out over time. In terms of the ownership issue, you know, you raised this point yesterday, and I was thinking about it overnight. And I'm not sure that I agree with the way that you're thinking about it. You know, from the whole resident standpoint, it's, you know, am I better off, you know, today with what I have versus what would happen after the town acquired, if that's the path that it goes. If the finances are right, over the next 30 years, the whole residents will be paying less as a consequence of the transaction. And then you observe that, okay, 30 years, you know, the whole residents don't own anything. I mean, technically, you're right that the town owns it, but from a ratepayer standpoint, the whole residents would be getting the same benefits of ownership that the Hingham residents would be getting, from the standpoint that there's a drop-off in costs of $7.5 million a year, just like you've paid off your home in 30 years and you don't have to pay the mortgage anymore. So I think from, you know, my view is from the perspective of a whole resident, they're getting from a not a whole resident, from a ratepayer that happens to live in Hull, that person is getting the same ownership benefits, that being the drop-off in the mortgage, in our analogy, to a Hull resident, to a Hingham resident that is also a ratepayer. And I think that's, to me, that's the fairest way to look at it. And your last point on the memorandum of understanding, there doesn't need to be a memorandum of understanding, and I don't think there will be a memorandum of understanding. As I tried to explain, and maybe not well, Hingham basically steps in the shoes of Aquarian. It becomes the owner, just as if another company bought it, they would become the owner. There doesn't need to be an intermunicipal agreement. There needs to be a level of cooperation. We need to, you know, ideally, we'd like to work with your road program to, you know, be most efficient in that respect. You know, that's what good neighbors should do with each other, but there doesn't need to be any legally binding agreement between the different towns. And as far as I'm aware, there would be no intention, if we went forward, of creating that document, because it would be superfluous. Okay.
Ma'am,
From
could I'd
earlier.
like to recognize some other people first, if you can just, let's get the,
That point.
say again?
I only want to say thank you.
Oh, okay.
And also, we have our differences, but my understanding is that there's a huge difference. We also have our light plant in Hull. There's a huge difference between running a light plant and running a water company. So, but I just thank you for your explanations to everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lemnios.
Thank you, Chairman Asher, and members of the committee. And again, I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to address you, and thank you for the diligence that you're examining this issue. There's certainly a great deal of complexity, and I just want to kind of speak to a few points that have kind of come up during the course of tonight's summary of this particular topic. So I've been a town manager and a town administrator for close to 30 years. Worked in 3 communities of different size, one which was the city of Attleboro, so different form of government, town of Natick, and the town of Hull. And in each one of those communities, there have been agreements between neighboring communities for the delivery of water and the transfer of water and so forth. And as a matter of fact, in Attleboro, that was an interstate agreement. So, you know, as you point out, it is very common for communities to have agreements in place or to have cross-border utilization. Works very simply, transparently, and you know, so the issue of having kind of a system that encompasses 3 different political subdivisions in this case is not unusual at all in Massachusetts, and is quite commonplace. And as a matter of fact, the town of Hull, the town of Hingham, town of Cohasset, the town in Norwell have an agreement in place and work collectively and collaboratively for our E911 dispatch. The town of Hull provides certain source services to a portion of the town of Hingham as well as the town of Cohasset. And by the way, the residents of Hingham and Cohasset do not have a vote, a direct vote in the rates that are set, but the town of Hull charges the exact same rate to the town of Hingham and Cohasset residents that are serviced by the town of Hull sewer system, as an example. So the concept of equity is well in place between the three communities. The concept of collaboration is well in place. There are mutual aid agreements for our public safety services, so if, additional ambulances are needed here in Hingham, if there's a major accident, Hull will roll an ambulance and vice versa, as an example. Our light departments work together when there are storms and so forth, and I know that running a water department is not the same as running a light department, but I would point out that there are about 42 or 43 municipal light departments in Massachusetts, and I suspect if you talk to the residents in those communities that are served by local public utilities, they will tell you that the service is excellent. So just as, Hingham's lights don't go out during major storms, Hull lights don't go out during major storms unless it's the external feed from the private utility that provides the one line of electricity into Hull. But if that line is up and there's a big storm going, our lights don't go out because we have a great local crew. So I wanted to point out that this concept of intermunicipal cooperation and intermunicipal collaboration is alive and well in Massachusetts. It's very common, and it's not particularly complex amongst town managers, town administrators, police chiefs, fire chiefs, and staff members. In terms of transparency, I know that Aquarian has made kind of a big deal about the DPU as a protector, and people have access and so forth, and I think your point is spot on. In order for a resident to go to a DPU hearing, they basically have to take a day off, and they've got to go into Boston. The water hearings and that I've seen throughout my career are usually held at 7:30 at night or 7, in their local community, and people can get to those hearings. Just as, Ms. Rowe is at this hearing tonight in Hingham, and I think you've been hosted quite nicely, by the way. So, okay. And I would note that in the most recent rate case, I believe Aquarian requested that there were certain documents that would be held in confidence and not available to the public, certain financial documents. That wouldn't happen at a public hearing because there is really no need to have executive session financial records for a local water department. I've never heard of it. But Aquarian petitioned the DPU to withhold records from the public at the last hearing. So none of us got to see those records. They were basically, I think the term is in camera or something like that. So, this notion that the DPU is the protector of transparency is just false. The other thing is the budget would be voted at a local town meeting. Right now, rate setting and the cost anybody pays is outsourced to Boston. People in Boston who are politically appointed to the DPU make the decision for people far away. The decision for rates would be held at the local level. And I've been to many a town meeting where rates are proposed and budgets are proposed and they're reduced because people say we're not really interested in doing that. I've also been to a town meeting, most recently in Hull, where there was a presentation made and a large bond issue for the sewer department. People had a lot of questions for the local officials, and they were there to answer those questions. The local official wasn't able to say, we really can't tell you that. You're not allowed to see that information. So, this issue of transparency, there's a heck of a lot more transparency on the local level. The structure that you described is a very common structure. In Natick, the Board of Selectmen, for instance, are the water commissioners. In some communities, there are separate water commissioners. As I understand the proposal is get it up and running. The Board of Selectmen right now are very knowledgeable about the whole process, and perhaps in a year or two, they'll say we'll establish a separate water commission. But those water commissioners, again, would be local residents. They're not going to be people from Boston. They're not going to be people from some far-off community. They're going to be people that are affected by their own vote. So local control is another aspect of what this whole proposal is about. In terms of the capital vendor and so forth, there are a couple different structures for that. I know that we have an operator for our sewer department. There's a relatively small dollar limit for capital projects that they can do. Anything beyond that, we would bring engineers in, review it, kick it around, and so forth. The water superintendent would be similar to a source superintendent in some communities. They basically ride quality control over the contract. They make sure there's contract adherence. They also collaborate to look at what the capital plan for the entire system is. So they're the eyes and ears of the residents into that system. They're making sure the residents are getting the bang for the buck out of the contractor. And they can explain, hopefully they have the skills to explain at a town meeting, you know, what's going on and what's the plan. And it actually works. It works in most communities that have a system. There is no question about the argument that there are communities that have troubles with their system. Well, I know a private company that has trouble with a system. You know, for, again, well over 100 years, this has been under private control, and there's a significant capital backlog, which is why Aquarian asked for an accelerated capital program, because there has been historically a neglect of the capital assets of the system. And the reason for that is that a portion of the rates are going back to the shareholders. They're not going into the system. Under this model, all of the rate money stays local. It doesn't get sent off to Australia, to the Macquaries who no longer own it, doesn't go to the current new owners and to the shareholders of the new owners, was the National Grid. Eversource, excuse me. It stays local. And that's the big distinction. There is a strong history, at least in Hingham, Hull, and 41 other communities, with local power. And it's cheaper power than you can get from private utilities. It's more reliable, and the systems are just better run. There's a strong history in Massachusetts of locally operated water departments. Again, if you look at the rate studies, you'll see those are generally cheaper. Right now, Hull residents are paying for very expensive water, and we have no equity share. If nothing is done for the next 35 years, we'll continue to pay for very expensive water and have no equity share. None. Right now, what will happen under this system, at least there'll be local control. Hull residents will be treated in the same manner as other ratepayers. And although there may not be an equity share for Hull residents, at least it's our neighbors that are making the decision, not some nameless, faceless corporation that has the #1 goal of pulling money out of the system to pay back the ratepayers. What has happened is Aquarian and their predecessor agencies have looked at this system as a financial instrument, not as a public utility. And that's the key distinction in my mind. This is a public utility providing a critical and vital service to the residents of these communities. It's essential that it be operated in a manner that provides safe water with proper capital reinvestment. It's not a financial instrument, but they have chosen to look at it that way first. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lemnius. Mr. Walsh.
Good evening, and thanks again. I'm John Walsh, Vice President of Operations, and despite what I just heard, I'm not nameless and faceless. I think many of you do know me. So a couple things that I want to correct that I just heard. One thing regarding our proposal for accelerated infrastructure investment, that is not based on catching up on infrastructure investment. That is based on making sure that future generations do not have to bear the brunt of capital investment needs. And in terms of transparency, if anyone wants to go through the transcription from the rate case, that was a lengthy discussion. The Attorney General's office was very much involved in that discussion, questioning me about this very topic. Was it catching up on infrastructure investment? Excuse me, it might have been one of the town attorneys who was asking me these questions as well. But it is not catching up on investment. It is being proactive and making sure that future generations don't see a big spike in the need for infrastructure investment. Second thing, and an important point for us, I heard that there's better run systems, or municipalities are better run systems. Aquarion's won a very select award from DEP for the past 5 years for our performance running this system. Depending on the year, it's between like 1% to 4% of water systems in the state that get that award, and we got it 4 out of the last 5 years. To the point of towns serving other towns. So we took a look at what the town, or what the selectmen had presented back in September, and you're suggesting that your proposal is normal, and you're saying that the vast majority of mid-sized systems in the state serve residents in another town. So of the 51 mid-sized systems in the state, only 5 of them serve customers directly in another town. And the number of residents that they serve, or number of customers, is between 14 and about 250. For example, Weymouth serves residents of Hingham, and I believe there's about 50 residents of Hingham who get their water from Weymouth. Anecdotally, one of those residents told me I think he's got a surcharge of like 20% on his bill because he's not a resident of Weymouth. So your plan to serve nearly 5,000 customers in both Hull and North Cohasset, it's at least rare, if not unprecedented. So I think it would be interesting to see the list of towns that you're referring to where one town is serving customers, businesses, and residents directly, setting their rates. So it would be interesting to get that list of towns you're referring to. And let's not confuse that with towns that serve other towns with wholesale agreements. There are towns who send water to another town through 1 or 2 large meters, but each town handles their own customers or own residents themselves. And I think there's a detail here that might have been missed. Your relationship, Hingham's relationship with Hull isn't going to be with the Hull town manager. It's going to be with the 5,000 individual customers in the town. So I'm not sure if Town Manager Lemnios is speaking on their behalf, but your relationship will be with those individual customers. And as someone who's been in this business for about 27 years, that is an important relationship. And you should understand that when you're buying a water system, you are buying an obligation to those people. It's an obligation to provide them clean, safe drinking water every minute of every day for their consumption, but you're also obligated to provide them enough water for fire protection. So what comes along with this is an obligation. Mr. Higgins.
Yes, sir.
You had mentioned a part-time planner, and I heard you describing a lot of the activity that will be necessary. And I understand that you do have a background in this business. So I appreciate that you actually shared that with everyone here. The question I would have, and you Mr. Krumholz, talked about hiring the right professionals. The question that I think you actually need to ask yourselves is, all that you talked about, the right professionals, the part-time planner, all that work that you described, are all those resources, the cost of all those resources in your model? Is it built in either into the contract operations cost or into the town side? That's one of the questions that we've had for folks for a while here. We have a question of whether or not you've got the full cost of running the business in your model. So that's the question, are those resources, the cost of all those resources in there?
We'll talk more about that next week, I think, on engineering.
And Mr. Krumholtz, I know I heard you say that if another company stepped in, it'd be the same as the town stepping in. There is a big difference. If another company stepped into our shoes, the DPU and the Attorney General would still be involved in our rate making and beyond that, all of our rules and regulations that the DPU is responsible for.
My point was specific to the question of the interaction with the owner and the whole residence. And I think the point I made was the point that you just suggested a few moments ago, which is the relationship is with the ratepayers individually, wherever their territory is, wherever they live. That was my point.
Correct. Okay. And then just one final point on the Department of Public Utilities process. So again, as I mentioned, the Attorney General is involved in that process as well, and they're involved as the customer advocate. So there are two pretty important parties that are involved in the process. And for folks who aren't familiar with it, it takes about a year and a half. I think we answered nearly 1,000 questions. We get questions, we have to answer them in writing. So over months and months, we answered this time about 1,000 questions. Many of those questions, I don't remember the exact number, are from the town attorneys. So the town attorneys are representing the town, they're representing the customers in the town, and through them you have a say. We are obligated to answer all those questions. And then what follows after that is, in this case, I think we had 3 or 4 days worth of hearings where me and in this case, our Director of Operations from Massachusetts and our financial folks sat and answered questions, and whatever those questions were, they could be about customer service, finance, engineering. We had a lot of discussion about this capital investment proposal we put forth. So all that is done under oath. It's transcribed. It's available on the website. I think that and all of those answers that we give, those are all on the DPU website. I think that shows a tremendous amount of transparency. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Special Counsel Ryan?
Good evening. Kerry Ryan. I'm Special Counsel to the Town of Hingham in the Aquarian matters. I just wanted to address very briefly this issue about the DPU, because my assumption is there's probably a lot of the people that haven't really dealt with the Department of Public Utilities and don't know exactly how it works. One of the things that could be very helpful to people if they don't know it is that you can look up currently online much of what we've been talking about when you talk about things that have happened at the DPU. You can actually go online, go to the Department of Public Utilities website, and as Mr. Asher noted, the docket number is 17-90, and that was the most recent water rate hearing. In that water rate hearing, there's only a couple of us that in this room tonight that were there, and I would have to disagree with the characterization that Aquarian just made, which is of the MRAM surcharge. The MRAM surcharge was described as something that was very necessary, and they presented something called the canoe model or the canoe study, and you can look up these things in the DPU docket 1790, and that study indicated that the amount of water mains that needed to be replaced needed to be expedited. They were behind, and that was the justification for the MRAM surcharge. And I know that earlier there was kind of an indication that the MRAM surcharge, somehow the DPU would make sure that Hull got their share or something like that. The DPU doesn't get involved in any of that. The DPU does not get into a managing of the company. That's something whoever the operator of the system is determines where the capital, where the water mains are replaced. And so I just wanted to basically at least point out this issue with the DPU. It's a complex process, it's a long process, but there is much information online. So I recommend to anybody that has an interest that they do go online and take a look at, because as Mr. Walsh did point out, they answer many questions, and all of those questions and answers are in the DPU file room that's online. Also, with regard to the Attorney General's office, the Town of Hingham's counsel, as well as Hull's counsel, who happens to be here tonight, we worked hand in hand with the Attorney General's office throughout the DPU hearings. So we're quite familiar with working with the Attorney General's office. It's something we did from the day one of the, both the public hearings, which are the hearings that are out in the public, for example, the one that was at Hull High School, and then in the day-to-day DPU hearings, which are basically run like a trial. And to the best of my memory, at least this most recent DPU hearing that went, I believe it went at least 5 days of testimony, I don't remember one resident there from anywhere. The only people that I remember being there were for either the company or the attorneys. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Ryan. Just a sec. Sir?
Skylar Thaxter, 246 Main Street. I was here last night, and I just had to add on to the question I had the other night. But I heard it said tonight we need to make a decision on best practices by other towns. And I hope to come here tonight to find, some models up there to show me. And I think going forward, if you're going to sell this to the town, I would like to see personally, and I'm just an individual person, I'm sort of on the fence trying to figure out where I feel about this whole issue. And I would have liked to have seen some definite models based on what other towns are doing that are good structures, whether you show it tomorrow night or whether it should have been shown tonight for governance. I don't believe the selectmen running the thing, they're advisory. And I've been on the Cable Commission for over 25 years. And when we had to look at negotiating new contracts, which they're doing tonight, we looked at everybody else's contracts. We went out there and gathered other towns that had settled so that we could know how to properly work with Comcast and Verizon. And I would have liked to have seen something based on something I just didn't feel like, wow, okay, he's got this going on the screen. There was nothing on there. And I just think that going forward, if you're going to sell this to town meeting, you need to say this is what our proposed structure is, period. And this is how we think it's going to work. I think it was sort of loosey-goosey. I'm sorry, but that's the way, as a citizen, I feel, and I would have liked to see more of that. And when you go to engineering, I think the same thing should happen, because, we want to know how our money is going to be spent. We got a lot of things on the table, and I know you say it's not going to cost us anything else, and it's all going to be done. And last night, that was a great presentation, and certainly very informative and well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me just say, and sorry I don't have a visual, but I guess
I'm an audiovisual person.
My hands will be my visual for the moment, because if I wasn't clear, I apologize. But I think structurally, based on what we've seen from other towns, excuse me.
But you have talked about other towns, and you mentioned a few, and you never, it sounds like, I don't know if
they're almost all the same.
And have you looked at all those towns?
Well, there's 300 towns
No, yeah, but you said
in
about
Massachusetts.
50.
We haven't looked at all of them, but we have looked at enough that I think we're very comfortable that the structure generally is you're going to have a management company and, a capital vendor,
Okay.
which may be one and the same or may be different. You're going to have a water superintendent
Yeah.
who is an employee of the town that reports to the town administrator, that reports to the water commissioners, and the water commissioners, the majority, I think, are actually the selectmen, but I think your options are they're one and the same as the selectmen, or they're separate, and if they're separate, they're either elected or appointed. And then you have over here a citizens advisory committee,
Right.
which we would, make
Right.
unique to our particular thing. So that's the structure that shows up pretty much across the board. And if I didn't make that clear, I apologize, but that's what we would be recommending.
Okay, when you report to the selectmen, it is usually reporting to the selectmen. The Cable Committee has an advisory committee that report to the selectmen. We used to have Comcast owning a big portion of it. Now we have a separate group that would be like the water company, and it works out much better, and it's great, but we still just report to the selectmen. The selectmen don't run, they don't know about cable. I'm very hesitant. If we had 5 selectmen, maybe there might be more to share, but we only have 3. And they do a great job, but it's a tough job.
And it may be that the answer at the end of the day is to have separate water commissioners. I don't think, I'm suggesting that that's not
I
the
think
right
it should be a
answer.
separate structure.
It just, as I said, I was focused on day one for the transition, what,
Yeah,
you
I
know, I
don't
think
know
is
about
best, but it
transition.
doesn't have to be that. You know, there are more than one way to skin the cat.
I think when you go forward, you know, like last night, that, you know, you had everything there, and the presentation was great. And I just like to see more firm stuff.
Great, thank you. Mr. Norman.
Richard Norman, 3 Sugar Avenue. By way of background, I've spent about 35 years in running both a energy company in the natural gas industry, as well as about 40 years in running about 11 hydroelectric plants. And recently, our company entered into a management contract very similar to what's being discussed right now with the city of Nashua, New Hampshire, to run 2 of their hydroelectric plants. I mention that only from the background and perspective, because when I look at something like this, I look at it as if I'm going to be hired to run this facility, and I ask myself, does what's being proposed work or doesn't it work? And I'd like to start off just asking one procedural question. You mentioned, Mr. Asher, that there was going to be presentations on financial governance and operations, and then there would be a vote of the committee. Is there going to be an opportunity for public comment subsequent to the completion of the 3 meetings that are dealing with these 3 aspects of the acquisition? Or is the opportunity of the public to comment at this point, you're then going to listen to people and say, we've conducted 3 meetings, we're going to take our vote now, without the opportunity for people to have learned from the various interrelated aspects of the 3 presentations? It's a simple question.
I think there'll be an opportunity for public comment next Wednesday, just as there's been last night, last Thursday, and tonight.
But I guess when will the vote be taken?
Our intent is to take it after our discussion next Wednesday, the 23rd of January.
And will there be, having completed the discussion of the operations, will then people be able to sort of look back on an overall basis and comment on the sum of the 3 presentations, or is the opportunity limited to each of the 3 presentations? I ask that because I'm somewhat puzzled about the way in which this process is going, and I would turn back. I know it was just financial, and I'm not going to get into any details, but last night there was a presentation made. There were 2 financial presentations. And my question at that point was, if I were on the committee, what am I going to vote on? What I have is just 2 pages, 2 extracts from, this is the financial update dated July 18th that was presented to the selectmen, and that was the only thing on record with regard to financial planning. And in it, there was $136 million of savings that were proposed. What was presented last night represented a material change in terms of the financial picture that is now presented. And I compliment the committee with regard to changing their form of financing. I think the form of financing now, as long as you properly handle the debt that's going to be incurred for the capital charges, is one that works for the town. And from my perspective, as long as that's done, I think that that's a financial leg that you can look at and say there are potential savings. But the question for tonight is governance. And the only thing that I'm aware of with regard to governance is the presentation that was made September 11th, governance and operations. And I went through that today, reading it as if I was going to take the job, asking myself, what does it say, and how does it conform to the presentation that was made tonight by Mr. Krumholst? And I'm being very, very literal in terms of the way I look at this presentation. And I would ask, is this what you're going to vote on? Because what I heard is, well, maybe a year from now, the selectmen are going to decide that they won't be the water commissioners. There's no mention in here about that. And there's a number of other very specific issues that are mentioned in here, which I think will influence how a voter will vote. So that's the question from a process perspective as to exactly what's happening and how the basis upon which the vote is going to be taken by your committees. So as an example, I've spent many, many hours in regulatory proceedings. The way they work, and unfortunately the way this committee has not worked, is that they have a work session beforehand, very relaxed. Everyone sits down and they try and understand what areas there are agreement, what areas are disagreement. Excuse me for a minute because I need some water. Which I didn't have last night. So I'm not going to bore you with each and every detail, but I'm going to give you some examples of questions which I have with regard to moving from Aquarian ownership to town ownership. Is there a description for a water superintendent? Has one been identified? How long will the capital program, how will capital contract programs be drafted? By whom? Who's going to negotiate them? Where do the technical, I'll give you a copy of this if you want. Where do the technical specifications come from? Will the town choose to follow the required bid program for capital contracts that Aquarian is required to follow under PUC regulations? What is the reporting authority relationship between the town administrator and the water superintendent? Because I think it's a very, very complex and unnecessarily complicated reporting relationship as it relates to his job and the role of the town administrator. I have a series of questions about O&M contracts, which what I understand is there will be a presentation, and my question is there one in existence? Will we see it next week? And then, who's going to draft and negotiate that contract? Is it going to be the town council? Is it going to be special counsel? What is the scope of responsibility? Can't answer that unless you know what the O&M contract says. I think I'm in full agreement with the change that you suggested, Mr. Asher, about the capital vendor. It makes no sense for the capital vendor to report directly to the water superintendent. And there's a myriad of problems with regard to interrelationship or interface between an O&M contractor and a third party who's putting a new line in, who has to interconnect, who has to do a bunch of other things. It just doesn't work. Your proposal, I think, is a very sound one, and I think that's the way the organization should be structured. There also is the question, and this was raised last night, it's the interrelationship, and that is, who and how long is it going to take for the town to actually be in a position to assume operations? There's no funds that I know of that have been allocated at this point, as an example, to go out on a job search or be in a position to offer a job to a water superintendent. You have a number of financial closing costs. There's a related question as to what the obligations of Aquarian are if, in fact, it will no longer own the company. I assume spare parts will be part of the purchase, but the systems that they have at the present time, call system, accounting, access to various chemistry facilities and whatever, those are something that may or may not come with the O&M agreement, and it's going to take some time. And putting aside the financial cost, the question was asked last night, realistically, you just don't take over a company it's going to take you 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months before you're really in a position to really start running a company, my opinion. There's a statement in the governance thing that says that the DEP regulates rates and rate structures for municipally owned companies.
That's not true.
I can cite it for
Does
you
it?
if you'd like, but
That's
it's in there.
Not accurate.
I went to try and find what that meant. I don't know,
Yeah, that's,
but it is in the governance plan. With regard to rate setting timeline and process, simply put, it's long, it's complicated, runs 8 months, and by the time you finish one budget, in the time that the O&M contractor is going to be doing current reports, he's going to have to be planning for the next year. An annual cycle, in my opinion, does not make sense for a company like this. It truly doesn't. You've also have the potential overlap in which the proposed form of the O&M contract was 1 year with possible extensions for 2 years. We were confronted, my company, in a similar situation. We wouldn't take a 1-year contract. If we took a 1-year contract, we'd want to have a buyout because you have to go and you have to hire people, you have to make a number of commitments, and there is a potential overlap if you're doing a 1-year budget cycle and the contract, the O&M contract, is scheduled to expire and you don't know whether it's going to be extended, we don't know whether the contract is going to be canceled and a new company is going to come in. That's one aspect that, to me, is somewhat problematic. If you can identify and be comfortable about a longer-term contract, I think that's a better way to go. I also, speaking as a ratepayer and as a taxpayer, think that the powers or role of a Citizens Advisory Board is much greater than what it should be. You've got a company to run, and it's a very different situation where you know what your financial obligations are going to be. If you have an O&M contract, it's going to represent a substantial part of your budget. And for the Citizens Advisory Committee to be meeting on an annual basis and then developing rate recommendations which are presented to the selectmen, I think is far too broad the authority, and yet that is what is proposed in the governance plan. I think there should be a Citizens Advisory Board, but I think it should have limited powers, not the powers that are presented in the presentation. The financial plan contemplates annual debt issuance. Without annual debt issuance, the cost of capital, of proposed capital repairs is either going to have to be delayed or it's going to have to be paid currently. The question, which I don't know whether it's been addressed or not, is that on a recurring basis, each and every year, according to the financial plan, there's going to have to be debt authorization. I'm not an expert in terms of town procedures, but my belief is it's got to come to a town vote, and it is something where either you're going to have to wait for planning on capital projects or not. A related question is, does it make any sense to go out and borrow $2 million every year or $2.5 million a year? Or is there some flexibility to go out and borrow for 2 or 3 or 4 years, build your working capital up? That's a detail. It hasn't been addressed. My assumption is that the debt issuance is something that can be handled. There also is a statement in the governance proposal, and I've heard differing positions, and I'd like to, if I could, get an answer. This categorically says that the town operation will be subject to prevailing wage law. I've heard other lawyers say, no, that's not true. But with respect to the companies that are hired to do capital programs, that's what the governance plan says. If that is the case, and this is where you get an interrelationship between the financial and the governance aspects of this, I've heard numbers, I don't have practical experience, but prevailing wage results in probably 20% plus or minus in terms of extra costs, which translates into, if we assume that wages represent about 50% of a capital project, for the $60 million that has been identified in the old financial plan, I'm not sure about the new one, that's $6 million less of capital programs that you can accomplish. And so the question is whether prevailing wage is something. I know that the accountants, quote unquote, said basically that it was insignificant. I think for 20%, if that is the case, it's something that ought to be noted. It's been mentioned before, it was on my list as well as far as hell, and the direct question is there an existing formal or informal intermunicipal agreement? It states in the governance proposal that there will be. I've heard that there won't be.
Yeah, sorry, just on that, if it was said there, it was said before we got further advice from council on that.
Okay.
But the definitive position at this point is that an MOU is not necessary and not contemplated.
Okay, I would respectfully disagree with you. My experience is that you have great relationships, but if something does go wrong, it's what counts on paper. It's not what people have said. And in this particular situation, looking ahead, and I'm not going to be here for 30 or 35 years, but my belief is that there are significant potential issues that lie ahead that can be managed, but I think there needs to be a clear understanding, so I'll just disagree with you. So my conclusion is, number one, I think you've made a lot of progress in terms of the financial side of the plan. I agree that town ownership would greatly simplify the operation of the municipal plant. I think from a budget perspective, it's pretty simple. You've got your financial costs, you've got your O&M costs, and then you've got your miscellaneous costs, and much of the questions of rate regulation just fall apart or disappear, given the fact that you've got one system rather than 4 or 5 systems. It's something where there is some substantial savings. Where I do disagree, and I'm going to be very blunt, I usually am, one of the reasons that I think a lot of voters have significant concerns is the very fact that the selectmen are proposed to be the water commissioners. I don't agree with you as to transparency. I think that the process that's been followed by this town has been far less than transparent, and I think that for the town to approve this situation, and I think it's easy for you to get a lot of voters if this operates in a more transparent way. I think that some people cited the brown water in Cohasset, the brown water in Situate. I'll add Flint to that. I just read a really interesting book about that, and it calls for some technical expertise on the part of decision makers. And I don't think you can count on that over a 30-year period with selectmen. A structure like the Hingham Light Board will give you a far greater chance, if not a certainty, that you'll have technical expertise, which you really need to have to efficiently operate a company. So I think it was Tom Mayo who said 3 legs to the stool. To me, the first leg, that's okay. I still have questions about the second leg, which is governance. I have questions about the role of the selectmen. I think they've got far more to do now, and the role that is proposed to them, particularly during transition, because this is not just taking over an existing company. This is really either a startup situation or it's an acquisition, and you're going to have a lot of things that are going to go on, and you need more than the experience that sits, and I don't say this in a personal way, you need more technical experience to efficiently handle the acquisition.
So let me just, sorry, did you want to say something? So let me just ask, you raised a whole bunch of points, and if you're not careful, you could end up being a water commissioner with your knowledge. But
They wouldn't have me, I'm too old.
no, we don't base it on age, let's be clear. From the structural standpoint, I hear what you're saying on the water commissioner, not being a selectman. I hear what you're saying on the citizens board. I think you might have, I personally think you might have overread
I know what-
the
I read what was
PowerPoint in
there.
terms of what their authority
Yeah.
is being. I think they're advisory, but I hear what you're saying on that. Other than those two observations from a pure structural standpoint, and I know there's a lot of detail which you've raised with very fair points, but from a structural standpoint, are you otherwise kind of in accord? So, you're talking about water commissioner, town administrator, superintendent, management company, and underneath the management company, capital vendor that's reporting to the management company, and over here, citizens advisory, or would you do some of that differently, other than what you've observed?
Now, if I understand you correctly, that the capital vendor would go through the operating company?
Yeah, I was acknowledging the point
Yeah.
that you made earlier.
With that,
Yeah.
I think the other thing is you can look at an organizational chart, and you can talk about it in terms of functional or administrative responsibilities. And to me, I think the town administrator shouldn't be in line with the water commissioner. If it's whoever the water commissioners are, I think the reporting relationship from an operational perspective should basically not have the town administrator. I mean, technically speaking, if he's supposed to go to the water commissioners,
Right.
he's got to go through the town administrator, and I don't think that really works.
Yeah, maybe it's a dotted line over here, because, he's an employee, so, on some level, obviously, he goes through the town administrator. But I hear what you're saying, just from a kind of efficiency, operationally, it should be more of a straight line to the water commissioner.
Yeah, and as I say, the other thing is that I don't believe just hiring one employee, and I understand there'd be administrative support, but I think that the structure which Aquarian is able to draw upon is the same as my company. These 11 plants that we run, we have a core group that are technically capable. We've got our regulatory lawyer in Washington, we've got lawyers in our states, and we have engineering firms that we draw upon. And that's the structure that Aquarian is able to draw upon as well. And I don't think that it's reasonable to be able to think that you're going to have one person who's going to have the background and capabilities to really address and understand all of the requirements, because one way is you hire the operating company and you basically just trust them. But I don't think you can do that. I think you have to have knowledge on the town side. And the knowledge on the town side, I think necessarily is going to have to involve some other resources than what have been identified. I mentioned specifications. If you're going to go and do a capital program, your vendor, you're going to tell your vendor what kind of pipe you're going to use. You're going to tell them the valves. If you've got a PLC system, you're the one that's going to develop those specifications. And I don't think, I've been the chief operating officer for these two companies I have, but I got a lot of people, I don't know the answers. Computers, PLCs, and stuff like that, that's all integral to having the knowledge to make sure you don't make a mistake. And I mentioned Flint not to be extreme, but as I said, I just finished reading, I recommend the book to everyone. It's called Meltdown. And there's only about a page and a half or 2 pages. And they talk about what happened in Flint. And the problem was that the decision makers didn't understand the technical consequences of the decision to bring the river water in and what would happen. And we don't have an extreme like that here. I don't suggest we do. But I am suggesting that there needs to be some recognition of additional services.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Did you want?
No, you covered it.
Mr. Mr. Norman, I make a couple of comments in terms of your observations. I think, to your point, I think it's been a bit of a learning process as we've proceeded through the past 6.5 years, and I think particularly your observation about the duration of an O&M contract. Interestingly, when we met with the water supervisor of the Hyannis water system, where they went through a process very similar to what Hingham is potentially contemplating, their initial RFP was for a 1-year contract with 1-year options. And they did that, and their second RFP was for a 3-year contract with options. And so I think we adjusted our thinking as a result of that. So I would agree with that. I think a number of the points you raised, from my perspective, and I wasn't involved with Josh and other folks studying governance at the level of detail they did, but I don't think we have all the answers to the detailed questions, some of the detailed questions you posed, but what I do take away from the work that's been done and the comparison with other towns is the main message, day one structure that is flexible enough to change. And I think that's what has me, as somebody who was involved with outsourcing from an information technology perspective, comfortable that I don't think I have to have all the answers to the really detailed questions, but I do agree that structurally there has to be something that day one is workable. Just a sec. Regarding debt authorizations every year, we've discussed with the town treasurer collector, with the town accountant, with the town's financial advisors, precisely the point that you raised. Does it really make sense, and bond counsel, does it make sense to issue $2 million notes debt every year? And the answer is probably not, mostly from an investor perspective. So the point you made a little while ago, I suspect would actually be the mechanism, which is there'd be a note that would be of greater magnitude that would cover multiple years' worth of whatever the capital expenditure amount is. And I think we've heard last Thursday, and it was discussed at great length last night, that it's more than what was in the July 2018 model. And I guess finally, what we also learned from at least the discussion I participated in with the Hyannis water supervisor, first of all, he reports to the DPW supervisor, so not the town administrator. Very workable, but they supplemented their relatively small staff with expertise that they contracted for, cost of service studies, capital asset assessments, rate structures and such. So I came away from that discussion kind of getting back to where Josh was presenting, that there's sort of a core that at least day one made sense to me, and supplement that with assessments, service studies that probably cost 30 to 50, maybe 70,000, depending upon what sort of study you want conducted, that would be useful to the town and really serve as a basis for downstream determination as to, do we need to hire somebody to do that too, or can we continue to avail ourselves through contractual engagements? So I think a lot of what you've cited this evening in the course of what we've done with our research is some of the documents, a good example is the financial analysis of last summer, have changed. And I think, to my view, have improved just by virtue of the learning process we've followed. So other questions? Ma'am, could I?
My name is Ava Das. I live in Hull, but I'm here as a member of the board of the Weir River Watershed Association. And I heard Mr. Krumholtz, refer to working more coherently on conservation issues regarding the watershed, is I think what you said. And I was wondering if you had some idea of how to formalize that, perhaps by having somebody from the Watershed Association on the Citizens Advisory Board or in some other sort of formal, ongoing kind of relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, whether some formalized relationship is necessary or whether there's, you know, there just needs to be a good level of communication and cooperation that if a watershed committee or a conservation committee sees issues that bear on, you know, the reservoir or other related issues or any issues having to do with water supply, that they have a superintendent that they can go to talk about it. They have a Citizens Advisory Committee to go talk to. Maybe that person ends up being on the Citizens Advisory Committee. I would think the first order of business for the Citizens Advisory Committee were people that have some specialized knowledge about the supply, you know, the water supply business. But, you know, it could be those things. I mean, I think you just have to get the best person. And
We have had some sort of ongoing relationship with Aquarian, where we have met with them on issues of where to get new water, how to conserve water, and things like that, and we feel like that's been a meaningful relationship.
well, that's great.
And we're
So
looking to continue and improve on that.
I would hope and expect that the town would achieve that goal, where to acquire the water supply.
Since it's the resource we're talking about, yes.
Exactly,
Thank you very
yes.
much.
Thank you. Mr. Lemnios.
A point of information, this gentleman's comment.
Could you come to the microphone, please?
Just observational and not, you know, in contradiction, but for instance, the town of Hull has a contract operations with our sewer operator. We've had successive 10-year contracts, so you can go out as far as 10 years. And of course, you have triggers within that contract that is not for performance. But we chose to do 10-year contracts, and we've done, I think, three successive 10-year contracts, precisely to the point that you were talking about earlier, that you really can't do a one-year contract. Any vendor will look at that and say it's just not, there's just too much risk to get involved in 1 year. And even 3 years, I think your price points at 3 years will be dramatically different than the price point at 10 years. You know, when the town gets into a position of looking at contract terms, you can do contract terms under MGL for as long as 10 years, and that we found that to be beneficial, you know, on a lot of different levels. In terms of the structure and the role of the town administrator, I'm a town manager, so I'm biased, I guess, but I think it was referenced that, you know, the water superintendent would be an employee, so there has to be some, you know, interaction from I guess, an employee-employer perspective. But, you know, we have the equivalent of water superintendent for our sewer department, and again, that person's primary role is to ride quality control over the contractor. And we do bring in other expertise to assist in the capital planning process, whether it be engineering firms, legal assistance, so forth. So we build the team very similar to what your company does when you're looking at approaching a problem, and Aquarian does as well. They bring expertise in when they're looking at, you know, a particular problem or capital plan. And in terms of financing, we just went through our last town meeting and put in place financing for the next 5 years worth of capital projects in order precisely to kind of, first of all, to give folks a clear sense of, you know, what the cash flow and the demand is going to be over a period of time, and also for financing purposes, so that, you know, you're not going to the marketplace every year, because the issuance costs on a small issue, you know, is disproportionate to, you know, a larger issue. So those pieces of the puzzle can all be managed, and they're not particularly unique to this situation. And there's, I think, broad experience, you know, around in the marketplace for that. And in terms of, you know, the qualities that you would want in a water superintendent, that can change over time. So, for instance, in our wastewater treatment facility, we're in an intensive capital phase over the course of the next 10 years. And we had a water superintendent that left, and we hired a wastewater treatment superintendent that's actually a PE and has got about 25 years of experience in the private sector as a consultant for a large engineering firm, because we looked at where we were organizationally and where we were kind of in workflow for the next 5 years or 10 years or so, and we said, okay, the skill set we need for this period is somebody that has that kind of a skill set. If we were in a more lockdown mode, and a mode where kind of we were over a larger capital hump, and we're more in kind of a, you know, kind of a regular operating cycle without huge capital demands onto the system, you know, the kinds of skills you might look for a superintendent would be slightly different. But you know, your points are well taken, that, you know, there has to be a very good contemplation of, you know, the qualifications and so forth, and the staffing for the system. But there are ample models available, and I think that, you know, in the public sector as well as the private sector, you know, it has become very commonplace to reach out to skill sets outside of your organization and bring them in as needed, as opposed to hiring them permanently and so forth. So I would suspect that would be similar to this model. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is James Lampkin, Town Council for the Town of Hull, and I'm a resident of Hull. I want to just add the commendations to your committee for extremely thorough and well-done presentations. I was here last night and this evening, and I've been to meetings over the last several years, and it's very refreshing that you are definitely dedicated and doing a wonderful job trying to protect the community and do the best for the community. I just want to comment on just a couple of things. We hear a lot about the DPU and about how that process is so good that we should want to stay at the DPU. And with all due respect to the DPU, they have a very tough job to do. It's highly technical, what goes on at the hearings in terms of having rate analysts and consultants come in and do a lot of the testifying. But a lot of that, however, is because those hearings concern, in my opinion, to a great degree on rate of return and return on equity, because it's a private utility, and under the regulations, those items have to be addressed. And an inordinate amount of time is spent by the DPU, because they have to, in order to approve what they feel is a sufficient return on equity and other financial aspects, which would not have to be in the consideration by whoever the water commissioners are if the community takes over the plant. And I think that's an important distinction and a very important cost savings. Also, I have no doubt that the Board of Selectmen or whoever the water commissioners are will entertain questions at their meetings when they're talking about the rates. I don't know what other boards in Hingham may be reviewing it, if you have an advisory board or a finance committee that might be weighing in on this, but I have every bit of confidence, knowing how local governments operate, that the people will come and ask them questions, and they will get answers. You don't have that with a DPU system. You have a couple of public hearings, as was said, there was one in Hull, and people come and they ask questions, and representatives of the company answer those questions. But for the most part, in Boston, it's all expert testimony. It's all pre-filed testimony. It's a very regimented process, and you would not have that level of complexity if you had a local operation. You certainly would have the expertise to advise and manage the type of system you would have here on a local level. When we've had a need to have consultants, consulting engineers, they're the ones that provide that expertise as to what type of plans you need to have, what type of equipment you need to design, what type of pipes and so forth. So all of that is certainly available, no different than if the water company was doing it, except you don't have that profit motivation, which is a big factor driving up the expenses of the system. So I just wanted to add those few comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from the public? Sir? Please, your name and address.
Richard Pedoni, 12 Newtown Drive, serving as counsel for Aquarian. Mr. Council, I'm sorry, the town Administrator for Hull pointed out the need for an enterprise fund to have a budget that's approved at town meeting. And it seems to me that actually before the town of Hingham can take over, we're going to have a two-step process here. Or there may be a need for a second town meeting, or I'm missing some part of the process, and that is a budget will need to be approved for the enterprise fund. Have you seen a budget, or are we going to have a second town meeting to approve it before the takeover takes effect?
Are we talking about governance tonight?
Yes, governance and the budget setting process for the enterprise.
I think that's described, as I recollect, in the document that was cited earlier, just sort of a flow of the budget process that would be part and parcel of enterprise fund budgeting that ultimately is documented in the consolidated annual financial report of the town.
So we couldn't get a budget in place partway through this coming year without another town meeting?
Oh, I will say, the budgeting process, I think, would drive off the financials that we've seen to date from Aquarian. I mean, kind of Josh's earlier point, it's sort of you step into what's there, rates would stay the same, much of the rest of the financials would stay the same, and then would be tuned for town specifics as opposed to, I mean, from an asset perspective, that would certainly be part of the balance sheet process. But I haven't gotten involved in the actual budgeting from a CAFR perspective for the enterprise fund.
Okay, so governance for the budgeting for the first year is not something this committee has taken a look at and when it would be proposed and set.
Well, is that true, based on the...
I mean, at that level of detail, I would agree that that's
Okay.
true. I mean, we haven't, like, sat down and figured out what's going to be the cash flow for that first
right.
year.
Yeah.
Make sure the cash flow is met before we get the budget set for the next year, and, with the borrowing, and, I mean, no, we haven't.
Right,
Yeah, I think, that's going to be,
At a high level, I think the flow is there, but I would echo what Josh said. I think at the detail level, that's work still to be done.
And do you envision it could be done, or is it discussed being done in time for this April's town meeting?
I'd envision it could be done, yes.
And do you know if that's ongoing and when there'll be an opportunity for public input on it, if that's the case?
At this point, I'm not aware, so I don't know the answer to your question.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Other questions from the public? Wow. Oh, one. Mr. Walsh?
Thanks again. John Walsh, Vice President of Operations at Aquarian. So I've heard a couple folks talk about all the expertise that's needed, and they are right. There's a fair amount of expertise that is needed to run a water system. There's a New York Times article from the past February that talks about the complexities of water systems and how water quality regulations have become complex enough that trying to meet one regulation risks not meeting another. There are numerous stories. Washington, D.C. 10 years ago had a lead in their water because they were trying to fix that problem. But there are many cases where that complexity, trying to meet one regulation, causes you not to meet another. Why I'm telling you this is you do need the expertise. And I'm going to go back to the question I asked before. Do you understand the level of expertise that's needed to do it? And is the cost of those resources included in the model? And I do know from last night's discussion that you haven't seen the model, and my understanding is you're not going to even see the model. So my question is, who actually is going to answer that? Who can say that you have the cost of all those resources built into your model? Here are those costs. Because right now, I don't think anyone in this room knows what cost of operation and maintenance is built into the latest model. So who can answer the question of what resources and expertise have you determined you need, what's the cost of those resources, and then can confirm whether it is in that model? And it sounds like you can't answer it, so my question is, are the selectmen going to entertain questions because presumably they have seen the model?
Well, after last night's discussion, I did follow up with the town administrator this morning and learned from him that he interfaced with Anderson Tax, Mr. Dondero, and that individual committed or indicated that he felt he could get a copy of the model to the town by the end of this month. So I think part of the answer to your question is we'll all know more when we see a copy of the model by the
So
end
the
of the month.
model's a spreadsheet, it's completed, the results are on a presentation. It is January 16th. Why would it take until the end of the month for someone to provide that model? And that's a sincere question. I was asked for our model when we presented it. Town administrator Tom Mayo asked me for it, and I got it to him within, I think, about 3 days. Your model's, the town's model is complete. It is a spreadsheet of a couple tabs. I'm not sure I understand why it would take somebody a half a month to get it and put it up on a website.
I'm obviously not able to answer the question. I have no idea what his other commitments are.
Can the community see the version that Tom Mayo's seen?
I don't think Tom Mayo has seen it. My point is that it will be received by the town, according to the discussion that I had with Tom Mayo this morning, by the end of the month.
So the savings.
All right, am I right? I thought he was also like creating some kind of almost audit letter or audit report to
Yeah, I
go
think there will
with
be
that, which I think is probably the delay.
a letter,
He's pulling
sort of
something together that is not fully created at this point.
to complement the slides that were presented last Thursday.
I can assure you, coming from a corporation and a business, we would not present a document, that presentation, we wouldn't present something like that to decision makers until what you just described was done. It's just a point that I guess, you know, we run business more differently, run our operation more rigorously. To that point, when you're talking about from your June or July model, if you add up all the debt, principal and interest payments from the initial debt and all the debt that you'd take on for capital expenditures, it comes up to over $250 million. That is an unprecedented amount of, that's an unprecedented financial commitment for the town. This past summer, there was a presentation by selectmen, at least I saw it once at an advisory committee meeting, and I believe it said that all of these large capital projects, like Foster School, library, I think a fire station, it added them all up, and I think it said expected them to cost, initial cost between 75 and 100 million. So the initial purchase of the water system is beyond the total cost of all those assets or all those considered projects combined. So it is an unprecedented financial commitment from the town, for the residents. Now, I bring that up because I want to tell you about the rigor that we put into big decisions like that.
Is this a governance discussion?
It
Mr.
isn't,
Walsh?
because I'm going to get right to
Okay.
the question of governance. So what we would expect on especially such an unprecedented financial commitment, when you're looking at governance models, what we would expect is an identification of the alternative approaches and an evaluation of the pros and cons of those approaches. I haven't heard much talk about a water district, and I'm assuming you're familiar with what a water district is.
Yep.
Did anybody study a water district?
I mean, I think we looked at it at a high level, but it didn't really seem to make any sense for any number of reasons. I honestly would have to go back and look for our thought process on that, but it was sufficiently apples to oranges that we didn't spend much time on it, and that was some time ago. So, I mean, when you looked at, I mean, I think that was typically because there were a lot of challenges and multiple interests that didn't apply here. When you looked at the entities that were most similar to our situation, the structure was basically what I've described with the variables.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to my initial question. I think it is a question that you should answer for the community. If this is a normal structure where you're saying one community where there's a water commission is serving customers directly, not through a wholesale agreement, where it's 1 meter at the town line to another town, but where you're serving thousands of people in another community, I think it would be worth providing that list of communities, because from our research on it, of the 51 mid-sized systems in the state, one of them provides water directly to 240 people. That's the max. Most of them are like Weymouth, serving approximately 50 people, customers in Hingham. So I don't think that your governance model is normal. I think it is unprecedented. A water district, that's what communities like Westwood Dedham did. And so, as I said, what we would expect is a summary of the pros and cons of those options, and it doesn't sound like that list exists for any resident to see.
Anything else?
Oh, I didn't hear the answer.
The answer is, you're asking whether we've compiled a list of all the towns and the numbers for each town, and how many are being served in which town. First of all, my comment was not limited just to what I think is the 40 in our cohort, not the 50 in our cohort. It was an observation statewide. And no, I have not sat down and compiled every town and every town that serves every other town and the number that is served in every other town. No, I have not done that. Does that answer your question?
It does, but your statement is that your statement is that the vast majority of those mid-sized communities serve residents in other towns.
Actually, I started saying vast, and then I retracted vast because I didn't know if I could say vast. So that was not exactly what I said, but I did say the majority. That's my understanding based on communications with state officials.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Thank you. Polly Rowe, 9 Rockview Road in Hull. I'm seeking your clarification on this, having listened tonight, having listened last night, having gone last week to the Board of Selectmen's, the different presentations, and also having witnessed Vice President John Walsh, who just spoke, make yet another request to the Board of Selectmen Chairman Paul Healy, and I believe it was for what I believe is called a non-binding bid for the contract operator. I believe the town had put out in August of 2018 requests for proposal for contract operators, and no contractors responded with a binding bid, but a couple of non-binding responses were made. I believe it says on the town website that information will be made publicly available and posted on the website. That was August 2018. This is January 19. I don't think it's still been posted. And I have repeatedly seen VP Walsh's requests for that information repeatedly denied. So my question is, at this time, and if not at this time, when will it happen? Does the town or this board have on record a contract operator? My understanding is that takes like a starting 40% or approximately 40% of the fees that are going to get charged to all ratepayers. And, trying to wrap one's mind around the financial aspect, not to mention financial and operations and governance, that seems like a huge missing piece of the puzzle. Can you speak to that? And if that doesn't exist now, the contract operator and what the scope of that is and the cost, when will you folks know that?
I think we will talk, or that will be discussed next Wednesday in the engineering piece of our analysis. I can't speak to the request that's been made. That's really a request that I think the town administrator, who's the chief procurement officer, should address. The committee didn't get involved with that.
So am I understanding, I want to make sure my understanding is accurate, when you say it will be discussed next week, does the town currently have a contract operator in mind, or just that whole issue will be?
It will issue an RFP. I think the current thinking, although this is just my opinion, I think the current thinking is that that would occur depending upon the result, if this is put before a town meeting, what the town meeting vote would be.
Okay.
I believe that's the current thinking, but again, that's a question better posed to the Chief Procurement Officer.
Okay, so just, again, clarifying my understanding of what you just said, so it sounds like the RFP for the contract operator would be put out following the Hingham April town meeting vote on the takeover bid, is that?
That's my current impression.
Okay.
If there were a vote to approve, I think that's my current impression, but again, that isn't a decision that this committee makes.
Okay, all right, thank you, appreciate that.
Sure. Any other questions? No? Well, okay, earlier than last night. Thank you. That concludes the committee's review and discussion of governance. Thank you again, Josh. Thanks for your good work, and good luck tomorrow with the replacement of your second hip. I will now accept a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
A motion, do I have a second?
Second.
Second, all in favor? Aye. Unanimous.